The galaxy knew only one truth: humanity was fragile. That was the belief held by the Vran-Tai Dominion, an empire of conquerors who had shattered world after world, subjugating entire civilizations under their dominion. To them, humans were but another footnote in their long history of conquest, a minor inconvenience on their path to absolute rule. But the Vran-Tai made one fatal miscalculation. They mistook resilience for weakness. On the distant colony of New Bastion, the last embers of human defiance smoldered. Once a thriving hub of interstellar trade, the planet was now a world on borrowed time. Above its atmosphere, defense platforms floated in a futile attempt to deter the inevitable. The stars above were no longer a frontier of hope, but the silent, witnesses of approaching doom. The Vran-Tai fleet would arrive within 3 months. The ultimatum had already been sent: surrender or be annihilated. Commander Elias Roth stood on the balcony of the war room, staring at the tactical readouts projected into the air before him. The simulations were relentless in their predictions, each one ending in the same inevitable outcome: destruction. Humanity's fleet, cobbled together from the remnants of lost battles, would be outnumbered 10 to 1. The planetary defenses would crumble in hours. Roth's fingers curled into fists. He had seen what the Vran-Tai did to conquered worlds. Surrender was not survival. It was extinction in slow motion. Behind him, the War Council debated their options in hushed, desperate voices. Politicians, admirals, and engineers all playing their parts in a losing game. There were no good choices left, only the illusion of control in the face of overwhelming might. That was when Dr. Vivian Kaas stepped forward. She had been silent through most of the meeting, her sharp eyes studying the despair around her with something resembling detached curiosity. But when she spoke, her voice carried none of the doubt that hung heavy in the room. "We build the impossible fortress." A pause, then scoffing. The murmurs turned into outright derision. The concept was absurd. There was no time, no resources, no precedent. Even humanity's greatest engineers would need years, decades, to construct something capable of withstanding a fleet of the Vran-Tai's magnitude. But Kaas continued, unfazed by their doubt. She unfurled blueprints, projections, and schematics that seemed more like the dreams of a madwoman than a practical war plan. An orbital fortress, not just a station, but a bastion, built into the very fabric of space, surrounding New Bastion with an impenetrable shield of technology never before attempted. A graviton barrier. The theory had existed for years, buried in classified research files and dismissed as an impossibility. A planetary-scale energy field capable of distorting space itself, absorbing and redirecting kinetic and energy-based attacks. In theory, it could withstand anything short of a star's collapse. But in practice, it had never been built. The skeptics dismissed it outright. The logistics alone were a nightmare. The amount of power required was beyond any known energy source. The sheer scale of construction, even with automated factories and nanofabricators, was beyond reason. Roth said nothing. At first, he simply studied Kaas, watching the way her fingers traced the holograms with certainty, the way her gaze remained unshaken even as the room turned against her. She truly believed this was possible, and more terrifyingly, she might be right. "If we don't try," she said, meeting his eyes, "we lose everything." The weight of her words settled over the room like a shroud. The silence stretched. And then Roth made his choice. The impossible fortress would be built, and the galaxy would learn, too late, the cost of underestimating humanity. The order had been given. Humanity would not run, it would not kneel. The impossible fortress would rise. The war room emptied within minutes, its occupants scattering across New Bastion to fulfill their roles. Engineers, military commanders, logistics officers, each with a monumental task ahead of them. The weight of an entire species rested on their shoulders. In the following days, the colony transformed. What had once been a world of uncertainty now pulsed with raw purpose. Factories worked day and night, their smokestacks filling the sky with the haze of industry. Orbital platforms were repurposed, their infrastructure cannibalized to feed the ravenous hunger of a fortress that had no right to exist. The doubts remained. The fear of failure whispered in the dark corners of every conversation. But the work continued. The first problem was time. Dr. Vivian Kaas had estimated that, under ideal conditions, constructing even the skeletal framework of the impossible fortress would take 10 years. They had less than 3 months before the Vran-Tai arrived. So, humanity did what it did best. It cut corners. Advanced AI were uploaded into fabrication networks, overseeing every aspect of construction. Civilian ships were stripped down for resources. New Bastion's own cities were dismantled, their materials repurposed for the fortress. The people sacrificed everything for survival. Still, it would not be enough. "We need raw material," Captain Renji Okoro said, arms crossed as he examined the ever-growing list of insufficient resources. "We're mining the crust of this planet dry, and we're still short on hyper-dense alloys for the inner shielding." Dr. Kaas barely looked up from her schematics. "Then we take it from somewhere else." Okoro blinked. "From where?" "The Vran-Tai have locked down every resource-rich system in the sector." A beat of silence. And then Roth spoke. "There's one place they haven't." The table fell silent. They all knew what he was suggesting. The graveyard, a star system littered with the wreckage of the first human Vran-Tai war, a place of hushed stories and unspoken horrors, where hundreds of thousands had died in a single doomed battle. No one had returned to it since. "We salvage the dead," Roth continued. "Their ships, ours, all of it. If we don't, we die anyway." The graveyard was exactly as the stories described it, a wasteland of shattered vessels, frozen corpses drifting through the void. Human warships, their hulls scarred by plasma fire, still bearing the flags of a fleet long gone. Vran-Tai cruisers, gutted and lifeless, a testament to the savagery of that forgotten battle. Ghosts of a war lost decades ago. Captain Okoro and his strike team moved with precision, scavenging what they could. The Vran-Tai metal composites were superior to anything humanity could forge in such a short time. Their remains would serve as the skeleton of the impossible fortress. A final, grim irony. They worked fast, knowing that any signal, any trace of activity could bring unwanted attention. They were too late. The enemy had been watching. The first explosion tore through the salvage hauler, a shockwave of fire and debris scattered the strike team, alarms blaring across their ships. In the next instant, the enemy revealed itself. They were smaller than the warships expected to arrive in 3 months, more akin to hunting packs than an invasion force. But they were still lethal. Their sleek, predatory craft cut through the darkness, weapons igniting the void. Panic flickered through the comms. The salvage crews were unarmed, not meant for a fight. "We're not winning this," Okoro shouted over the channel. "We need to run now." But Roth's voice cut through. "The chaos. We don't run. We take them." Orders snapped across the fleet. The salvage ships, never meant for combat, reoriented their cargo loads, turning the very wreckage of war into makeshift projectiles. Okoro grinned. Humanity had spent centuries adapting to impossible odds. This was no different. Launch debris. Clusters, now. Chunks of ancient warships, some twice the size of the raider craft, were hurled through space. The first wave of enemy fighters dodged, their agility keeping them alive. The second wave wasn't so lucky. Wreckage crashed into their hulls, shredding them apart. Others, scrambling to evade, exposed themselves to counterfire from new bastions, emergency reinforcements. It wasn't a battle. It was a lesson. Humanity did not fight fair. Within minutes, the surviving Vran-Tai ships fled, vanishing into the void. The message was clear. The impossible fortress was no longer a rumor. It was becoming real, but victory came at a cost. The raid had been too loud, Within days, intercepted transmissions confirmed their worst fear. The Vran-Tai knew what they were building. The 3-month countdown was no longer a countdown at all. The full Vran-Tai Armada was coming, and it would arrive weeks ahead of schedule. Roth stood in the command center, jaw clenched as the intelligence report flickered before him. He had known, deep down, that this moment would come. The gamble had paid off. They had the resources to finish the fortress. Now they had to survive long enough to do it. Kaas, standing beside him, exhaled slowly. She tapped the display, where the growing framework of the impossible fortress hovered. Then we work faster. No hesitation. No doubt, because they knew the truth. If the Vran-Tai wanted humanity's destruction, then they would have to break the unbreakable. And for the first time in history, that might not be possible. The countdown had accelerated. What was once 3 months had shrunk to a mere 6 weeks. The impossible fortress, humanity's last gambit against extinction, was far from complete. The outer shell was barely functional, its defensive arrays nothing more than half-assembled frameworks of metal and energy conduits. The graviton barrier, the keystone of the entire defense, remained untested. If it failed, if the calculations were even slightly off, it would collapse the fortress under its own gravitational strain. There was no time for hesitation. New Bastion had become a planet of frantic hands and sleepless eyes. The fortress rose in the skies above them, an unnatural monolith, its skeletal structure a dark omen against the stars. Laborers worked in shifts with no rest, guided by AI, overseers that kept the process running at a terrifying pace. Supply convoys moved like arteries, ferrying what little humanity had left into the growing stronghold. But something else had changed. Hope had turned into obsession. The people of New Bastion no longer just wanted to survive. They wanted to win. The Vran-Tai did not wait for the full armada. They wanted to break humanity before the fortress was completed. The first attack came in the dead of the artificial night, as orbital workers welded final plating onto the fortress's outer ring. Sensors barely had time to register the incoming fleet before alarms blared across New Bastion. The first strike fleet of the Vran-Tai Dominion, a vanguard force of 20 warships, each one superior to anything humanity had in its arsenal. They were not here to invade. They were here to cripple the construction before it could be finished. Commander Roth was already in the war room before the alarms even finished their first cycle. Across the holographic display, he saw the true extent of their desperation. The impossible fortress's defensive grid was inactive. The weapons systems were not yet online. The Vran-Tai could tear them apart before the structure ever reached completion, unless they made them fight a different battle. The fleet approached, weapons primed. The fortress was nothing but a half-built carcass, defenseless, vulnerable. The Vran-Tai warships rushed forward to finish it. Then, the outer hull of the fortress shifted. Massive magnetic harpoons, desperate improvised weapons, launched from hidden ports along the framework, latching onto the incoming ships. Explosive cables ignited, binding enemy warships to the incomplete structure itself. The Vran-Tai screamed in outrage. Their own speed had become their undoing. Before they could break free, the orbital scaffolders, human workers and exo-rigs, descended upon them like swarms of mechanized insects. Welding torches, construction cutters and plasma saws, tools never meant for war, were turned into weapons. Vran-Tai crews were dragged from their cockpits by men who had spent their lives building civilizations, and now, in their final days, were tearing them apart with their bare hands. The enemy fleet faltered. Chaos spread through their ranks. The first ship to break free was too slow. An improvised mass driver rail fired a chunk of wreckage straight into its bridge, turning it into scrap metal. The rest of the enemy ships realized they had been lured into a scrapyard brawl they could not win. They retreated, breaking away, abandoning their fallen. The first battle for the impossible fortress had been won, and the war had only just begun. The days after the battle were filled with whispers. The people of New Bastion once filled. With fear, were now filled with something else, rage. They had drawn first blood. For the first time, they had forced the Vran-Tai to retreat. The fortress was no longer just a desperate gamble. It was proof that humanity would not simply resist, it would defy. But Roth knew the truth. The first strike fleet was nothing compared to what was coming. The full Vran-Tai Grand Armada was en route, thousands of ships, billions of tons of firepower, and now they would come with vengeance. In a silent moment, he stood before the window of the war room, looking out at the fortress. It loomed there, incomplete, an unfinished promise of survival. It wasn't enough, and yet, deep down, he felt something he hadn't in years, a sliver of hope. Not everyone believed in the fortress. There were those who feared it more than they feared the enemy. 2 weeks after the battle, a saboteur was caught within the command structure, a high-ranking logistics officer, one of their own. He had attempted to transmit the blueprints of the fortress to the Vran-Tai. Under interrogation, his words were not of cowardice, but of certainty. "You think this is our salvation?" he whispered. "But you are making something else. You are making a monster." The room fell silent. The galaxy has seen our kind before. The ones who build fortresses like this. The ones who refuse to fall. They don't just survive. His eyes burned with something that almost looked like fear. They become conquerors. The silence stretched. Then Roth gave the order. The traitor was executed. With weeks left before the Grand Armada's arrival, the impossible fortress was close to completion. But one problem remained. The graviton barrier, the one thing that could make them truly untouchable, had not been tested. If it failed, it would collapse the entire structure into itself, taking new Bastion with it. There was one way to know if it would hold. They had to fire it up. Kaas stood at the control console, hands poised over the activation sequence. If she was wrong, they would all die today, instead of weeks from now. She took a breath and activated the fortress. A shockwave rippled through space, the very fabric of reality distorted as the graviton barrier formed around the fortress. Then, for a moment, nothing. The silence stretched. Then a Vran-Tai warship, one of the crippled stragglers left behind from the last battle, drifted too close. It fired a desperate final shot. The plasma bolt hit the barrier and disappeared. The war room erupted into cheers. It had worked. They had built the impossible. But Roth, watching from his command chair, did not cheer, because he knew what was coming. Somewhere, beyond the darkness of the stars, the Vran-Tai Grand Armada was already changing course. The final battle for humanity's survival was no longer approaching. It had already begun. The sky above New Bastion was on fire. The Vran-Tai Grand Armada had arrived. It did not come in waves. It did not come with hesitation. It arrived as a storm, an unbroken line of warships so vast that they blotted out the stars. Thousands of vessels, each one capable of annihilating a world on its own. And at the center of it all, commanding from the bridge of the eternal Dominion, stood the Arbiter, the supreme commander of the Vran-Tai war machine. His orders were absolute. His purpose was singular. Burn the fortress. Crush humanity. End this defiance forever. From the depths of the impossible fortress, Commander Elias. Roth watched the nightmare unfold. His hands were steady, his face unreadable. This was it, the moment all their desperate efforts had been leading toward. There would be no second chance. He turned to Dr. Kaas. "Is the barrier holding?" Her fingers danced across the controls. "Holding," she confirmed, though there was something unreadable in her voice. For now, that was the problem. For now, because the Arbiter was no fool. The first volley of the battle wasn't a conventional barrage. It wasn't plasma fire or kinetic strikes. It was graviton destabilizers. The Vran-Tai had adapted. They had scanned the impossible fortress from their last engagement and realized that brute force wouldn't work. So they had brought weapons designed to unravel the very fabric of the graviton barrier. Kaas's breath caught in her throat as the readings spiked. "They're targeting the barrier itself," she whispered. Roth didn't need to be told what that meant. If the barrier fell, they were dead, and the Vran-Tai knew it. The first graviton destabilizer hit with a force beyond comprehension. The impossible fortress shuddered. Metal groaned. The energy readings spiked into the red. The field buckled under the attack but held, for now. "Reinforce it!" Kaas shouted, her hands blurring over the controls. AI subroutines struggled to compensate, diverting more power, shifting the frequency, buying them seconds. The second destabilizer struck. The entire station lurched. Roth steadied himself against the command terminal. Seconds. That's all they were gaining. If the enemy kept up this pace, the barrier would collapse within minutes. "We have to strike back," Captain Okoro growled. "Hit them before they fire again." "The fortress isn't armed yet," Kaas reminded him, but Roth had been waiting for this moment. He turned to the tactical map, eyes narrowing. "No, but we have something else." He pointed at the debris field still orbiting the battlefield. Wreckage from the previous fights. Shattered Vran-Tai warships. Dead human battleships. Twisted metal and corpses drifting like ghosts. Okoro saw it at the same time Roth did. His lips curled into something almost like admiration. "Command the drone fleets," Roth ordered. "Use the salvage haulers. We turn their own wreckage into weapons." The Vran-Tai gunners never saw it coming. They had been too focused on dismantling the fortress. They didn't realize that the very wreckage of their fallen had become part of the battlefield. Humanity's drones, meant for construction, not combat, were repurposed for one final act of defiance. They latched onto the floating debris, propelling it at hypersonic speeds directly into the enemy fleet. Suddenly, the battlefield became a graveyard of moving corpses and metal. Dead warships, shattered and forgotten, were turned into improvised railgun slugs, slamming into Vran-Tai vessels with devastating force. Crippled human destroyer, once lost to the void, was reactivated remotely and set on a collision course with a Vran-Tai command frigate. The frigate's shields held, for a moment. Then the destroyer's reactor detonated, consuming both ships. In a violent inferno, the Vran-Tai reeled. The Arbiter, watching from his throne aboard the Eternal Dominion, narrowed his eyes. He had underestimated human ingenuity again, but he would not make that mistake twice. With a flick of his hand, he gave the order, "Bring forth the Behemoth." A ripple passed through the enemy ranks. Then, emerging from the black void, the largest Vran-Tai warship ever seen entered the battlefield. It dwarfed everything, a moving fortress of its own, larger than New Bastion's capital city. The Behemoth-class Annihilator, a weapon never before deployed. A ship designed to shatter planetary defenses in a single strike, and it had only one target, the impossible fortress. Kaas's voice was calm, too calm, when she spoke. "If that thing fires," she said, "we die." Roth exhaled. He already knew. The impossible fortress had been built to withstand a siege, not a planet killer. They had one shot. "The graviton barrier can't stop that," Kaas admitted. "Then we use it for something else," Roth said. Kaas turned to him. Confused, Roth's voice was level. "Can we reverse it?" For a moment no one spoke. Then Kaas understood. The graviton barrier wasn't just a shield. It was gravity itself, a manipulated force of physics, bending reality to their will. If they reversed the polarity, they wouldn't stop the Behemoth's shot, they would send it back. Kaas hesitated for only a second. Then she nodded. "Give me 5 minutes." "You have 2. The Behemoth's superweapon began charging. The glow of its cannon drowned out the stars. The Vran-Tai stopped their attack, watching in reverence as their ultimate weapon prepared. to wipe humanity from existence. The Arbiter watched. Certain. Absolute, the cannon fired. A beam of annihilation, large enough to consume an entire continent, surged toward the fortress. And then, the barrier shifted, reality bent, the energy slammed. Into the fortress. But instead of collapsing, the gravitational field absorbed it, held it, turned it, and in a single, impossible moment, the fortress fired back. The Vran-Tai had designed a weapon capable of destroying a planet. They had never imagined it being used against them. The beam, now twisted and amplified by the gravitational field, tore through the Grand Armada like the wrath of a vengeful god. Dozens of ships vanished in an instant. The Behemoth, the unstoppable warship, the ultimate tool of destruction, took its own shot directly to the hull. For a moment, it held together. Then it collapsed in on itself, imploding into a singularity. The Arbiter's final words never left his lips. The Eternal Dominion tried to flee. It didn't make it. The Grand Armada was broken. The battle was over. The impossible fortress had not just survived, it had defied the laws of war itself. Roth exhaled slowly, staring at the wreckage. His people were cheering, voices rising across every channel. They had done it. They had won. But deep down, he knew this was not the end. Because somewhere in the ruins of the Vran-Tai fleet, a distress beacon pulsed. And it was not Vran-Tai technology. Something else had been watching, something far worse. And now, it knew humanity's name. The battlefield was silent. For the first time in weeks, months, there were no alarms, no distant roars of approaching fleets, no countdowns of impending annihilation. Only wreckage remained. The Vran-Tai Grand Armada, once an unstoppable force, had been shattered. What remained of their once mighty fleet now drifted, broken and lifeless, through the void above New Bastion. Twisted metal, shattered warships, the burnt-out husks of vessels that had once been the pride of an empire, and humanity still stood, the impossible fortress had held. Roth stood in the war room staring at the tactical displays. The enemy fleet was gone, either destroyed or retreating into deep space. The orbital debris field was so dense that it cast unnatural shadows on the surface of New Bastion. The cheers from his crew had faded into exhausted silence. It was over. They had won. The cost of victory, the fortress still stood, but it had come at a price. Entire districts of New Bastion had been leveled during the siege. Families torn apart. Thousands had died defending the impossible fortress before it had even reached completion. The graviton barrier, their ultimate shield, had been pushed to the brink of collapse. One more shot, one more miscalculation, and it would have torn itself and the entire planet apart. The fortress had not just defied physics, it had defied fate itself. Kaas sat at her console, fingers hovering over the controls. The numbers on her screen told a terrible truth. "We came within seconds of disaster," she murmured. She didn't have to explain. They had all felt it, the sheer impossibility of what had happened. For a brief, terrifying moment, the universe itself had bent to human defiance, and that meant something far worse than victory. It meant others had noticed. It came from the wreckage of the Vran-Tai fleet. A single distress beacon. But it was not Vran-Tai technology. The signal pulsed unnaturally, its frequency shifting in ways that should have been impossible. It was older than the Dominion itself, buried beneath layers of encrypted code that no human system could decipher. Kaas analyzed it in silence. Then, without a word, she sent the signal to Roth. He listened. The voice that spoke was not Vran-Tai. It was something else, something ancient, something that had been waiting. And now, it had awoken. "We have watched. We have learned. And now, We know what you are. Roth's blood turned to ice. Because the transmission didn't end, it continued. As if whoever or whatever had sent it wasn't just speaking to them, it was speaking about them. A species that defies extinction. A species that builds the impossible. A species that will not kneel. We did not believe it could happen again. We were wrong. The transmission cut. The room was silent. And for the first time since the war began, Roth felt true fear. The people of New Bastion celebrated in the streets. The impossible fortress had been built. The Vran-Tai had been defeated. But in the war room, among the few who understood what had truly happened, there was no celebration. Only realization. Roth turned to Kaas. They weren't just watching the battle, he said. They were watching us. Kaas exhaled slowly, her hands still shaking. And now they know what we can do. The implications were terrifying. For decades, humanity had been an afterthought in the galactic hierarchy, a minor species, barely worth acknowledging. The Vran-Tai had underestimated them. The galaxy had ignored them. Not anymore. The impossible fortress had changed everything, because humanity had done something that was not supposed to be possible. They had built a weapon that defied logic, that twisted the very fabric of space itself, that turned the laws of warfare against those who had written them. The galaxy had always feared the Vran-Tai. Now they would fear humanity even more. 2 days later, a message was recovered from the wreckage of the Eternal Dominion, the flagship of the Vran-Tai Grand Armada. It was from the Arbiter, sent moments before his death. A final warning. We thought you were like the others. We were wrong. There is something far worse than us in this galaxy, and now they have seen you. The message ended abruptly, cut off by the moment of the ship's destruction. But the words lingered. Something was out there. Something older than the Vran-Tai. Something that had waited in the dark, believing that humanity would fall like all the others before them. But now they knew, and they were coming. Roth stood atop the observation deck, staring out at the remains of the battlefield. The impossible fortress floated above New Bastion, its structure scarred but unbroken. Behind him, Kaas approached. "You should get some rest," she said. Roth didn't look at her. Instead, he asked, "Do you think we made a mistake?" Kaas hesitated. "We survived." "That's not what I asked." She followed his gaze. She knew what he meant. The war was over. But in their desperate struggle to survive, they had done something irreversible. They had proven what humanity was capable of, and now, the galaxy would never be the same. Kaas exhaled, glancing at the fortress. It loomed above them like a silent god, a monument not just to survival, but to defiance itself. She finally spoke. "I think we've only just begun." Roth nodded. Then, without another word, he turned away from the battlefield, because he knew deep down that this wasn't the end of the war. It was the beginning of something much worse. And when the time came, when whatever watched them finally decided to make itself known, humanity would be ready, no matter what. The stars above New Bastion were no longer empty. The wreckage of the Vran-Tai Grand Armada drifted silently, a graveyard of shattered warships stretching across the void. The impossible fortress loomed at the center of it all, scarred, but undefeated. Humanity had done the impossible. They had not just survived, they had won. But victory had a price. It came 3 days after the battle, a transmission. Not Vran-Tai, not human, something else. A signal so vast, so precise, that it bypassed every known encryption protocol. It didn't just break through the impossible fortress's defenses. It ignored them as though they weren't even there. The message was not a warning. It was an invitation. Humanity, you have been seen. You have proven yourselves an anomaly. A species that builds the impossible, that resists what cannot be resisted. We believed you would fall. Now, we must see what else you can do. The signal cut. Nothing else. No coordinates, no demands, just the knowledge that something else was out there. Something far older than the Vran-Tai. Something that had waited. And now, it was watching them. In the war room, Roth and Kaas stood over the holo display. The decoded transmission flickered before them. The words, translated into human language, seemed too simple for something so enormous. "We should ignore it," Captain Okoro muttered. His voice was steady, but there was something behind it, something close to fear. "We already have enemies. We don't need another." "They'll come whether we ignore them or not," Kaas murmured. Her eyes never left the transmission. "They've been watching since the beginning." Roth exhaled slowly. He thought of the Arbiter's final words. "There is something far worse than us in this galaxy." He looked at the impossible fortress, its hull still glowing from battle damage. It had saved them, but it had also mocked them. Humanity had stepped out of the shadows, and now something was stepping toward them. A week later, a deep space probe detected something at the far edge of the system. A structure, a gate, ancient, dormant, waiting. It pulsed once, as if it had been waiting for human eyes to see it. Roth clenched his fists. "This isn't over," he said, and deep down, they all knew the truth. The war with the Vran-Tai had ended, but humanity's true battle was about to begin.